Okay, so thank you everyone for coming this evening. I'm going to try and keep this to 10 minutes to do a quick rattle through how to create and manage species-rich meadows. I know from introductions that we've just done that I think quite a few of you have got some element of grassland management. It's a big topic. I won't cover everything, but we'll have time to talk about it afterwards. So the first question is to ask, well, what are you aiming for? You can see there are two pictures on the screen here, and one is a species-rich native grassland and the other is a field of annual cornfield annuals. So if you're aiming for kind of beautiful flowers that come up every year that look like the picture on the right, then you're going to have a lot of management to do, because these are annual cornfield flower or annual flowers that come up from cornfields. That's why they're called cornfield annuals, because that ground is disturbed every year, which is why they come up. This mix is actually quite good, but some of the ones that you might see kind of in the media, on the news, come from that they'll have a mix of species in there that aren't necessarily native. So I'd always be very cautious about these kind of flower mixes that show lots of flowers, because you're never sure if they're native species and they might require quite intensive management to get them. The picture on the left, you can see it's got a lot of flowers in it. It's mostly bird's-foot trefoil and clover, I think, in the image we've got, but there's also a lot of grass. And what's really important to remember with meadows is the grass is as important as the flowers. But also, I would ask, well, do you already know what you've got? So the idea of creating a meadow is lovely, but you might not actually have to start from scratch. So the first question I would always ask a group coming to me for advice about it is, well, what's in there? Do you have any idea? And it might be that you don't, because maybe it's mown all the time, or maybe you don't just because you haven't had a chance to look at it. So normally I would recommend give it a year or a season so that you've got time to let it grow, see what's in it, and that will help you then to make some decisions about how to manage it. If it's been mown short, and if it's regularly mown short, see if you can get an arrangement where that isn't the case. So then when you've had a chance to have a look at it and you've seen what's in there, there are a variety of things that you might find. So you might find it's a bit like the picture on the left here. It's a lot of dock, there's a lot of thistle, there are things like ragwort, there are quite vigorous plants growing within the area that you're looking at. That means they're probably growing on nutrient-rich soil, and these need to be got under control first. And that control can take the form of digging, as you've got in this picture here, but it could also be pulling. In some cases, simply cutting the seed heads makes a big difference, so you're reducing the seeds that are going back into it. But it might also be that you need to spray it. So actually the group for the picture on the left here, they are digging out dock, but we have recommended that they might want to spray them, because they can, if you've got a lot of dock, if any of you have done it ever, digging out dock is extremely hard work, and you might find that spot spraying is what you need to do to get rid of them before you then look at your next stage in the management. You might find that you've got a lot of grass and maybe some flowers coming through, but maybe the grass is quite thick and there's a thick mat of it, so that if you try and seed anything, or if you were to try and seed anything, that would struggle to come through. In that case, what you might have to do is scarify, which is what we've done in the picture in the middle. And scarifying is really trying to break up that thick mat of turf so that you start to create space for some of the wildflowers to come through, and not just vigorous grasses that might be growing there. One thing you might also do if you've got something like a lot of nettles is actually the reverse of what you might think, is to mow it. Some plants really don't handle being cut frequently, and we've done this on a couple of sites where we just needed to get rid of the nettles. We couldn't spray everything, it wasn't appropriate. So we've just consistently mown that site and that for a year, and we're probably now in a position where we might now look at introducing some other wildflower seed as we start to reduce the vigour of the nettles that are coming through. You can potentially do that on a site where you've got a thick grass mat as well, as I've said for the picture in the middle, but you might well find that scarifying is what you need to do. You might also find that you've got actually quite a lot of wildflowers coming through and some grasses, and all you really need to do is change the mowing regime. So the picture on the right hand side, Loretta might recognise this picture actually. This is from a churchyard near Chin. Now we've actually mown the path, but there are areas of that churchyard that have been left to grow long to allow the grasses to come through, and then some wildflowers that are coming through that will be cut later on in the season. Whatever you choose to do, what you have to do is remove any grass cuttings that you've got, because what you're aiming to do is reduce the nutrients that are in the soil. Also, what you're aiming to do, particularly in the case of the first two pictures, is have some areas of bare ground, so that if you do seed it, the seeds have got somewhere to germinate, and they're competing less with the other plants that are growing on the site. Okay, so talked a bit about mowing. Let's say you've chosen to allow the site to grow. And really, when we talk about mowing, what we're really trying to do is mimic what would happen if we had livestock on the site, because that's how most of our meadows have developed in some way or form. You might have cows on site, or you might have sheep on site, have had historically had sheep on site, and they both act slightly differently on the grass. So cows will trample and create bare areas, and they also pull grass, so that creates bare patches, which is what allows wildflowers to develop, which is also why I've said, you know, if you're scarifying or digging, then you're kind of doing something similar there. Sheep nibble, so that means they create patches where low growing plants can cope, or things like thyme will grow, because sheep tend to avoid the plants that are more fragrant. So a lot of our herbs have developed as a defense against being grazed. So when we mow, we're really looking at trying to mimic what might happen in that more traditional system. So the ideal is to get to a position where you're cutting once a year in late August, early September. So once things have flowered and set seed, then you would cut the site and leave it ready for the next year, and cut it before obviously it gets too wet. You would cut a bit earlier. If you've got a site where it's very vigorous growth, you might try and cut a bit earlier in August while you've still got green growth in the grass, because that helps to weaken it as well. In some cases as well, if you can get onto the site in early spring, you can also do an early spring cut, because again, if you're trying to reduce nutrients, you can get in, you can cut, take away some of the cuttings, and then this gives the flowering plants chance to come up. But obviously you don't want to leave it too late in spring, because some things will already be coming up then. So that depends a little bit on your site and what you've got growing there. In some places you might decide you want to cut more frequently. That might be for amenity reasons, that might be because of some of the species that are growing that can cope with being cut more frequently. It might also be that you then increase the diversity of the grass height. So you've got long grass that you're leaving all the way to the end of August. You might have short mown paths like you saw in the other picture, but maybe you want some kind of medium height grass. So then you would look at cutting that every 6 weeks or so. And if you really were in the position to have livestock on, obviously, then you might look at having a grazier, but some livestock on a couple of times through the season. Whatever you choose to do in terms of mowing, you need to remove the cuttings. That's the key management principle really for trying to create a wildflower meadow, is removal of the material that you cut. And if you think about it, livestock do that. Partly they do it because they eat it, it goes through them, and then obviously that comes out in their droppings. So they are putting some nutrient back. That's already been processed and reduced, and then it's deposited in quite kind of confined areas. Also, in some traditional management systems, you'll have had livestock on a meadow for a while, but then they will be taken in overnight, and certainly they're taken in during the winter, so that's also removing nutrients. So a lot of what we do in the management really is trying to behave like livestock, but with a machine. It's also, I mean, you probably picked this up from what I've said about the mowing, but it's really important to remember that there's no size fits all with the meadow management. You might have to try a variety of things to get the results that you're looking for. So then the next step, once you've looked at what have you got on site, how do you think you need to treat it in terms of digging things out, pulling them up, maybe scarifying, and certainly changing the mowing, then what do you do next? Are you in a position where actually you've got quite a lot of wildflowers coming through, so you can just change that mowing regime and then monitor it for a while, maybe a couple of years, and see what comes through? You might be in a position where you know you've got a lot of vigorous grass, you've scarified it, and actually now you really need to try and reduce that. Most of you will have heard some mention of this plant on the screen now, yellow rattle. It's semi-parasitic on grasses, so it is used a lot in conservation management to try to reduce grass vigor. Most groups that I've worked with, we've sown yellow rattle at some point in the project, and it does help to start to bring those grasses down, but it needs a little bit of time. It does, as with any wildflower, as I've mentioned, it needs some bare ground to seed into, and you might find that you can't see it coming up, but actually it is. And over time, it can get quite dominant. So I would sow it and then be patient with it coming through. You might need another year to see what's happening with that. And then possibly at the same time, or you might wait a year and then do this later, then you can sow some wildflower seed. Now, there are a number of different ways of doing this. You might be, as I've kind of mentioned, waiting for natural colonization. So you've changed the mowing, maybe you've put some yellow rattle in, and then you're just going to see if other things start to come in, because possibly you're in a location where there's a seed source nearby, so things can come in naturally. If you're lucky, you might have somebody nearby, a landowner nearby, who's got a meadow, and you could ask for some of his green hay that's got seed in it and scatter that on your site. That's probably the best option, because then you know that you're getting seed that's local to your area. Of course, if that's not an option, then you might buy seed mixes. You can actually then, in the seed in the picture, the pot on the right is yellow rattle, the pot on the left is actually cornfield annual seed. So that maybe not exactly the mix that we'd be talking about, but then you can buy seed mixes from a trusted supplier. So that goes back to the first picture. Be wary of what's in the mix. There are a couple of suppliers that we use for our seed, Emmersgate and Naturescape, where we trust where that seed's come from. If you're in a small area, you want a quick result, you can buy species-rich turf as well. And that's a pretty quick result. Needs a bit of looking after when it goes in, but if it's a small area, that might be viable. And you might also be in a position where you've got some topsoil from somewhere that has a seed bank in it. But I'd be careful with that it's not too nutrient rich, because as I've put on the slide, you need to avoid fertile topsoil, because all that will do is encourage back those very vigorous plants that are not necessarily what you're aiming for. And then the last image is, once you've done all of that, which takes a bit of time, you need to make sure you've got a management plan in place and that you're able to monitor what's happening on the site, because it might be that you need to go back to one of those stages that I've mentioned and reapply it to your site. And if you're really keen, you might have volunteers who are keen to side it for you as well. That's me. Happy for any questions.